The screaming started before Kesha Winston could even process what was happening. One moment, she was bouncing baby Ava on her hip, while Darius adjusted their carry-on bags in the TSA security line. And the next moment, two uniformed HOA security officers were yanking their 18-month-old daughter from her arms. "Ma'am, step back immediately." The taller officer, badge reading J. Mitchell, grabbed Ava so roughly that the toddler's pink pacifier flew across the polished airport floor. "We have reasonable suspicion that this child is being trafficked." The words hit Kesha like a physical blow. Around them, the busy Monday morning crowd at Denver International Airport began to slow, phones emerging from pockets, curious eyes turning toward the commotion. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker more harshly as her world tilted sideways. "What did you just say?" Darius's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several nearby travelers step back. At 6'3", with broad shoulders filling out his gray hoodie, he commanded attention even when he wasn't speaking. Now, with his dark eyes fixed on the officers, he radiated barely contained fury. Officer Mitchell's partner, a stocky woman whose nameplate read S. Rodriguez, moved to flank the family while keeping one hand conspicuously near her taser. "Sir, remain calm and keep your hands visible. We're conducting a routine investigation based on an alert that came through our system." 6-year-old Malik pressed himself against his father's leg, his small hand clutching the strap of his superhero backpack. His wide brown eyes darted between the officers and his crying sister, confusion and fear written across his young face. "Daddy, why are they taking Ava?" "I don't know. Buddy?" Darius's jaw tightened as he watched Mitchell bounce his daughter awkwardly, clearly inexperienced with handling children. "But we're going to sort this out right now." The Winston family had risen at 4:30 that morning to catch their 7 a.m. flight to Atlanta. Darius's grandmother, the matriarch who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, had passed away 3 days earlier. The funeral was scheduled for Wednesday, and they needed to be there to support his mother through what would undoubtedly be the hardest day of her life. They had packed quickly, efficiently. Darius threw on his most comfortable travel outfit, dark jeans, Nike sneakers, and the gray Georgetown hoodie Kesha had bought him for Christmas. Kesha opted for black leggings, a soft blue sweater, and her hair pulled back in a neat bun that she hoped would survive the chaos of traveling with 2 young children. They looked like what they were, a middle-class family heading to a funeral, tired but determined to be there for each other. Now, standing in the security line with their boarding passes clutched in Kesha's trembling hand, they looked like suspects in the eyes of these officers. "What alert?" Kesha's voice cracked as she reached toward her daughter, who was now sobbing and reaching back for her mother. "We're flying to my husband's grandmother's funeral. This is our daughter. These are our children." Rodriguez pulled out a tablet, swiping through what appeared to be some kind of database. "According to our system, a family matching your description was reported for shoplifting at the Hudson newsstand approximately 20 minutes ago. 3 individuals of your demographic, traveling with small children, fled the scene when confronted by security." "Our demographic." The words came out of Darius like a growl. "What exactly does that mean, Officer Rodriguez?" Mitchell adjusted his grip on Ava, who was now wailing at full volume. Other travelers were beginning to record with their phones, creating a loose circle around the confrontation. The TSA agents at the nearby checkpoint had noticed the disturbance, but seemed content to let the HOA officers handle whatever was happening. "It means," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "that we have a credible report of individuals who look exactly like you, engaging in criminal activity in this airport. Now, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, but you're coming with us for questioning." Kesha felt the world spinning around her. She was a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital Colorado, used to high-stress situations and life-or-death decisions. But this was different. This was her family, her children, being treated like criminals based on nothing more than the color of their skin. "Show them our identification," she whispered to Darius, her voice barely audible over Ava's crying. "Show them our boarding passes. Show them we're not whoever they think we are." Darius reached slowly into his back pocket, moving with deliberate care to avoid giving the officers any excuse to escalate further. "My wallet is in my back pocket. Our boarding passes are in my wife's hand. We're the Winston family, flying to Atlanta on Delta Flight 1205. You can verify this in 30 seconds. Sir, step away from your pockets and place your hands behind your back." Rodriguez had her handcuffs out now, the metal glinting under the harsh airport lighting. "We'll examine your identification after you're secured." Secured. Kesha's voice rose to match her daughter's wails. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're trying to get to a funeral." But the officers were no longer listening to reason, if they ever had been. Mitchell passed Ava to Rodriguez while he moved behind Darius, and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut seemed to echo through the terminal, despite the ambient noise of thousands of travelers. The metal was cold against Darius's wrists, but not as cold as the realization that his children were watching their father being arrested for no reason other than existing while black in an airport. He could feel Malik's hand still gripping his leg, could hear Kesha's sharp intake of breath, could see the phones recording every moment of this humiliation. "Mommy, what's happening?" Malik's voice was small and scared. "Why are they hurting Daddy?" Kesha knelt down to her son's level, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "They're making a mistake, baby. Just a big mistake. But it's going to be okay." Rodriguez was now holding Ava while trying to examine the family's boarding passes with one hand. The toddler had moved beyond crying into the kind of exhausted hiccuping that came after prolonged distress. Her little face was red and blotchy, her usual bright smile replaced by the devastated confusion of a child who didn't understand why strangers were keeping her from her parents. "Ma'am, you need to come with us as well," Rodriguez announced, apparently satisfied with whatever she had or hadn't found in their travel documents. "We need to question you separately about your activities in the airport this morning." Separately. The word came out as a strangled whisper. "You want to separate me from my children?" Mitchell was already guiding Darius away from the family, and Kesha could see her husband's jaw working as he struggled to maintain his composure. She knew that look, knew he was fighting every instinct to resist, to protect his family, to demand the respect they deserved as human beings. But she also knew he was calculating the risks, thinking about what resistance might cost them, might cost their children. "The children will be taken to airport family services while we sort this out," Rodriguez said matter-of-factly, as if discussing weather. "Standard protocol for situations involving potential child endangerment." Child endangerment. Kesha's voice cracked completely now. "We're taking our children to their great-grandmother's funeral. The only people endangering these children are you." But her protests fell on deaf ears. Within minutes, she found herself in a small, windowless room deep in the bowels of the airport, separated from her husband and her children, facing accusations that seemed to come from some alternate reality where loving parents were automatically criminals. The interrogation room smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the metal table where Rodriguez had placed Kesha's purse, cell phone, and the boarding passes that should have proven their innocence. "Mrs. Winston," Rodriguez began, settling into the chair across from her with a manila folder. Let's start from the beginning. What were you doing at Hudson News this morning? Kesha stared at the officer in disbelief. I've never been to Hudson News this morning. I've never been to Hudson News in my life. We came straight from security screening to the gate area when you stopped us. According to the report, 3 individuals matching your family's description were observed concealing merchandise and fleeing when confronted. The total value of the stolen items was over $200. Then you have the wrong family. Kesha's hands were shaking now, adrenaline and fear making it difficult to think clearly. Check the security cameras. Check our credit card records. Check anything you want. But give me back my babies. Rodriguez made a note in her folder. We'll certainly be checking security footage. In the meantime, I need you to account for your whereabouts from 6 a.m. until the time we detained you. The questions continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Where did they live? What did her husband do for work? How long had they been planning this trip? Why were they traveling with so much cash? They weren't. Why did her husband seem so agitated? Because you're treating us like criminals. Why couldn't she provide a receipt for every item in their carry-on bags? Because that's insane. Meanwhile, 3 rooms down, Darius sat handcuffed to a chair while Mitchell paced around him like a predator, circling prey. The room was even smaller than the one where they were holding Kesha, and the walls seemed to press in as the officer's questions grew more aggressive. Here's what I think happened, Mitchell said, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. I think you saw an opportunity to grab some expensive items, while your wife distracted the clerk with the crying baby. I think when security approached, you played the race card to create confusion and slipped away in the chaos. Darius had been silent through most of the interrogation, his training kicking in even as his personal anguish threatened to overwhelm him. He knew that anything he said could be twisted, that cooperation might be seen as guilt, that resistance would definitely be seen as guilt. But Mitchell's latest accusation finally broke through his restraint. The race card. His voice was deadly quiet. You think being falsely accused of theft and child trafficking while my 18-month-old daughter screams for her mother is me playing a card? Mitchell shrugged. I think you're exactly the kind of person who would exploit people's sympathy to avoid consequences for your actions. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Darius felt something shift inside him, some final thread of patience snapping as he thought about his children being held by strangers, his wife being interrogated like a criminal, his grandmother's funeral that they might miss because of this insanity. You want to know what kind of person I am? He leaned forward, as much as the handcuffs would allow. I'm the kind of person who gets up at 4:30 in the morning to fly across the country for a funeral. I'm the kind of person who works 16-hour days to provide for his family. I'm the kind of person who teaches his son to respect authority even when authority doesn't respect him back. Mitchell looked unimpressed. Save the sob story. I've heard it all before. I'm also the kind of person, Darius continued, his voice growing steadier with each word, who doesn't let anyone hurt his family without consequences. Back in family services, Malik sat in a plastic chair that was too big for his small frame, holding his sister, while a well-meaning but overwhelmed airport employee tried to calm them both down. Ava had cried herself into exhausted sleep against her brother's shoulder. But Malik remained wide awake, his young mind trying to process what was happening to his family. Where are my parents? He asked for the 10th time. When can I see my parents? The employee, a middle-aged woman named Janet, had been giving him variations of the same non-answer for the past hour. They're talking to some officers right now. Sweetheart. They'll be back soon. But Malik was 6 years old. Not stupid. He had seen the handcuffs on his father's wrists, had heard the accusations about trafficking and theft, had felt the fear radiating from his mother. He understood that something was very, very wrong, even if he couldn't put it into words. "My daddy is not a bad person," he said quietly, adjusting his grip on his sleeping sister. "He helps people. He catches the real bad guys." Janet smiled sadly. "I'm sure he's a good daddy to you." "No," Malik insisted with the fierce certainty that only children possess. "He's not just good to me. He's good to everyone. He has a special job where he protects people from really bad guys. He showed me his badge once." The woman's expression shifted slightly. "What kind of badge? Honey?" But before Malik could answer, Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, looking harried and slightly uncertain for the first time since this ordeal began. "Janet, we need to extend the hold on these children," she announced. "The parents aren't cooperating with the investigation, and we're going to need more time to sort this out." Malik's eyes widened. "How much more time?" Rodriguez barely glanced at him. "Could be hours. Could be longer. We're treating this as a serious criminal matter now." "But our plane," Malik's voice rose to near panic. "We have to go to Great-Grandma's funeral. Daddy said we promised we'd be there." "Your family should have thought about that before they decided to steal from the airport," Rodriguez replied coldly. "Actions have consequences." The callousness of the response shocked even Janet, who had worked in family services long enough to see some genuinely heartbreaking situations. But something about the way this child spoke about his father, the genuine confusion and fear in his voice, made her wonder if there might be more to this story than the officers were sharing. As Rodriguez turned to leave, Malik called out desperately, "Wait, you have to listen to me. My daddy isn't a thief. He works for—" "Son," Rodriguez interrupted, "your daddy is in a lot of trouble right now. The best thing you can do is stay quiet and let the adults handle this." But as she walked away, Malik's words followed her down the hallway. "My daddy works for the FBI. He catches terrorists. He's one of the good guys." Rodriguez paused for just a moment, then shook her head and continued walking. Children said all kinds of things when they were scared. Their father was probably a security guard or a police officer somewhere, and the kid was just exaggerating. It wouldn't be the first time a family had tried to claim false credentials to get out of trouble. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Mitchell had moved on to a new line of questioning that made Darius's blood run cold. "You know, Mr. Winston, I've been thinking about your son," the officer said casually, consulting his notes. 6 years old. Right. That's about the age when kids start to understand the difference between right and wrong. Darius's hands clenched into fists behind his back. "Leave my son out of this!" Hard to do that, considering he's a witness to his parents' criminal activity. Makes me wonder what kind of values you're teaching at home. What kind of example you're setting. The words were carefully chosen, designed to provoke a reaction. Mitchell had been trained in interrogation techniques, knew how to find pressure points and exploit them. A man's children were always the most effective leverage. "I mean, statistically speaking," Mitchell continued, settling back in his chair, as if discussing something academic. "Children who grow up in households with criminal activity are significantly more likely to engage in criminal behavior themselves. Your boy could be looking at a future in juvenile detention, maybe adult prison by the time he's 18. Generational crime, they call it." Darius felt the handcuffs cutting into his wrists as his muscles tensed involuntarily. Every fiber of his being wanted to launch himself across that table and show this smug bastard exactly what happened to people who threatened his children. But years of training held him back. Professional discipline warring with paternal fury. "You don't know anything about my son. he said through gritted teeth. I know he's got a thief for a father and a mother who enables criminal behavior. I know he's being raised to think he can take whatever he wants without consequences. That's a recipe for disaster. Mr. Winston, that's how we end up with career criminals. The silence that followed was dangerous. Electric, with barely contained violence. Mitchell seemed to sense that he had pushed too far, but his training told him to press the advantage, to use the emotional reaction to break down his suspect's defenses. Of course, he said with fake sympathy. If you were to confess now, show some remorse, we might be able to work something out. Maybe get the charges reduced. Keep this whole thing from affecting your children's future too severely. Darius looked up at him then, and Mitchell took an involuntary step backward. There was something in the man's eyes that spoke of experiences beyond civilian life, of decisions made in situations where the stakes were measured in lives rather than dollars. Officer Mitchell, Darius said quietly, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember exactly what you just said about my children. Because when this is over, when the truth comes out, I want you to remember that you chose to threaten a 6-year-old boy and an 18-month-old girl to try to force a confession for crimes we didn't commit. Something in his tone made Mitchell pause. There was no bluster, no anger, just a calm certainty that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. Are you threatening me, Mr. Winston? I'm making you a promise, Darius replied. I'm promising that there will be consequences for what you've done here today. Not threats, not violence, but real, legal, career-ending consequences. Mitchell laughed, but it sounded forced. Big talk from a man in handcuffs. The handcuffs are temporary, Darius said, but what you've done to my family today, that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. The confidence in his voice was starting to unnerve Mitchell, who had expected the usual cycle of anger, bargaining, and eventual capitulation that most suspects went through. Instead, this man seemed to be getting calmer, more focused, as if he knew something that Mitchell didn't. Which, as it turned out, he did. Darius Winston had been keeping 2 significant pieces of information to himself since this nightmare began. The first was in his wallet, which Rodriguez had confiscated, but apparently hadn't examined closely. Tucked behind his driver's license and credit cards was a badge and identification card that would have ended this interrogation before it started. Assistant Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counter-Terrorism Division. The second was even more damaging to the officer's future prospects. The small device clipped to the inside of his hoodie, which they had mistaken for a fitness tracker or smartwatch, was actually a secure communication device issued by the Bureau. It had been recording and transmitting everything that had happened since the moment they first approached his family, streaming directly to the Joint Terrorism Task Force Command Center in Denver. Every word, every threat, every violation of their civil rights was being documented in real time by federal agents who were already coordinating a response. The only reason Darius hadn't revealed his identity immediately was that he wanted to see how far these officers would go, how deep their prejudice ran, how thoroughly they would incriminate themselves when they thought there would be no consequences. He was building a case, and they were giving him everything he needed. But as Mitchell's threats against his children grew more explicit, Darius realized that the cost of gathering evidence was becoming too high. His family had already endured enough trauma for one lifetime. Officer Mitchell, he said, his voice carrying a new note of authority. I need you to reach into my back pocket and examine my wallet very carefully. Mitchell frowned. We already have your wallet. No, you took my wallet. You haven't examined it. I need you to look behind my driver's license and tell me what you find. Something in his tone made Mitchell hesitate. The absolute certainty. The lack of fear. The way he spoke as if he were the one in control despite being handcuffed to a chair. It was unsettling in a way that Mitchell couldn't quite define. "Why would I do that?" "Because," Darius said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "In about 30 seconds. You're going to wish you had done it 3 hours ago." Mitchell stared at him for a long moment, then reluctantly moved to the evidence bag containing Darius's personal effects. He pulled out the leather wallet, noting its quality expensive, but not flashy. The kind carried by someone who had money, but didn't need to show it off. Behind the driver's license, exactly where Darius had said it would be, was a badge that made Mitchell's hands shake as he held it. Federal Bureau of Investigation. He read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Assistant Director, Counter-Terrorism Division. He looked up at Darius with wide eyes. This can't be real." "Call the number on the back," Darius suggested mildly. "Ask for Deputy Director Sarah Chen. Tell her you're holding Assistant Director Winston and his family on suspicion of shoplifting. I'm curious to hear her response." Mitchell's face had gone pale. "If this is real, if you're really—" "I'm really a federal law enforcement officer who was traveling with his family to attend his grandmother's funeral," Darius confirmed. "I'm really someone who has spent the last 15 years of his life fighting terrorism and protecting innocent people. And you really just spent 3 hours accusing me of trafficking my own children." The full implications of what had happened were beginning to sink in. Mitchell looked at the badge again, then at Darius, then back at the badge. His career wasn't just over. He was looking at federal charges, civil rights violations, possible prison time. "But the alert," he stammered. "The shoplifting report was either a mistake or completely fabricated." Darius said calmly, "Which you would have discovered if you had done any actual investigative work, instead of jumping to conclusions based on the color of our skin." Mitchell set the badge down with trembling hands. We need to... This is where you uncuff me, reunite me with my family, and start praying that I'm in a forgiving mood," Darius suggested. "Although I should mention that everything that has happened here today has been recorded and transmitted to federal authorities." He nodded toward the device on his hoodie, which Mitchell had ignored throughout the interrogation. "Secure communication device, issued by the Bureau, with real-time streaming capabilities. Your threats against my children, your racially motivated assumptions, your complete disregard for proper procedure, it's all been documented." Mitchell stared at the device in horror. If what Darius was saying was true, then federal agents had been watching this entire debacle unfold in real time. They had heard every word, seen every violation, documented every mistake. "How many people?" Mitchell's voice cracked. "How many people have been watching?" "The entire Joint Terrorism Task Force Command Center," Darius replied. "Plus, whoever they've briefed in the last few hours. I'd estimate about 50 federal agents, maybe more by now." The room fell silent except for the buzzing of the fluorescent light overhead. Mitchell looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and Darius felt a moment of something that might have been pity. "Officer Mitchell," he said more gently, "I want you to understand something. 3 hours ago, you had a choice. You could have treated my family with basic human dignity, verified our identity through proper channels, and avoided this entire situation. Instead, you chose to see criminals where there were none, to see threats where there was only love." Mitchell nodded numbly, still staring at the FBI badge. "Now, you have another choice," Darius continued. You can do the right thing, reunite me with my family, end this harassment, and face the consequences of your actions with whatever dignity you have left. Or, you can compound your mistakes by continuing down this path. The officer looked up at him with desperate eyes. What happens to me now? That depends on a lot of factors, Darius said honestly. Your cooperation from this point forward will certainly be taken into account. Your treatment of my children, the trauma you've caused my family, the blatant civil rights violations, those will also be factors. He leaned forward as much as the handcuffs would allow. But I'll tell you this, Officer Mitchell, if anything happens to my children because of the delay you've caused, if they suffer any additional trauma because you're too proud or too stupid to admit your mistakes, then I will make it my personal mission to ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions. Mitchell's hands shook as he reached for the keys to the handcuffs. The metal restraints fell away, and Darius rubbed his wrists where they had cut into his skin. For the first time in hours, he was free to move, free to hold his children, free to protect his family. But as he stood up, the door burst open and Rodriguez entered, looking flustered and slightly panicked. Mitchell, we've got a problem, she announced before noticing that Darius was no longer restrained. Why is he uncuffed? Mitchell held up the FBI badge with a trembling hand. Because he's a federal agent. Rodriguez. He's Assistant Director of the FBI Counter-Terrorism Division. Rodriguez stared at the badge, then at Darius, then back at the badge. That's impossible. That has to be fake. Call the number, Darius suggested again. But I should warn you, federal agents are already en route to this location. They've been monitoring this situation for hours. As if summoned by his words, the building's emergency communication system crackled to life. All HOA security personnel, report to Conference Room C immediately for emergency briefing. All HOA security personnel to Conference Room C. Rodriguez looked at Mitchell with growing panic. What does that mean? It means, Darius said, straightening his hoodie and checking his communication device, that your supervisors are about to have a very unpleasant conversation with some very serious federal agents. He moved toward the door, and both officers instinctively stepped aside. There was something different about him now that the handcuffs were off. Something that spoke of authority and competence that went far beyond what they had assumed based on his casual clothes and race. Where are my children? He asked, and it wasn't really a question. Family Services, Rodriguez stammered. Down the hall, third door on the left. Darius nodded and walked out of the interrogation room, leaving the two officers staring at each other in growing horror. Behind him, he could hear Mitchell's voice, shaky and desperate. Rodriguez, I think we're fucked. The hallway seemed longer than it had 3 hours earlier, but Darius forced himself to walk calmly, professionally. Every instinct screamed at him to run to his children, to gather them in his arms and never let anyone hurt them again. But he was still on duty, still representing the Bureau, still gathering evidence for what would inevitably be a complex legal case. He could hear voices from Conference Room C as he passed urgent, angry voices that suggested the federal response had already begun. Good. Let them scramble. Let them try to explain the inexplicable, justify the unjustifiable. The door to Family Services was slightly ajar, and through it, he could hear the most beautiful sound in the world, his son's voice. Steady and protective, talking quietly to his sister. It's okay, Ava, Malik was saying. Daddy's coming. He's probably already scared away all the bad guys. He's really good at that. Darius pushed open the door and saw his children huddled together in a chair that was too big for both of them. Malik had his arms wrapped around Ava, who was awake now, but quiet, sucking her thumb and staring at the door as if willing her parents to appear. "Daddy." Malik's face lit up with relief and joy. "I told them you were one of the good guys, but they wouldn't listen." Darius crossed the room in 3 quick strides and gathered both children into his arms, feeling their solid warmth, breathing in their familiar scent, letting himself believe for just a moment that they were all safe. "I'm here," he whispered into Malik's hair. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving you again." Ava looked up at him with her mother's eyes, still confused, but no longer afraid now that she was back in her father's arms. She patted his cheek with her small hand and said, "Dada," which was the most beautiful word he had ever heard. Janet, the family services worker, stood in the corner looking relieved and slightly confused. "Mr. Winston, the officers said you were—" "The officers made a mistake," Darius said firmly. "Several mistakes. Where is my wife?" "She's still being questioned. They said they needed to verify some information." Darius's jaw tightened. Kesha had been alone in an interrogation room for hours, probably terrified for her children, probably blaming herself for a situation that was completely beyond her control. "That ends now," he said, standing with Ava still in his arms and Malik holding tightly to his hand. "We're going to get Mommy, and then we're leaving." As they walked back down the hallway, Darius could hear the chaos from conference room C growing louder. Multiple voices, raised in argument, the sound of chairs scraping against floors. Someone was getting very angry. And, from the tone, it sounded like federal agents explaining reality to local security officers. The door to Kesha's interrogation room was closed, but Darius didn't bother knocking. He pushed it open to find his wife sitting across from Rodriguez, who looked like she was fighting panic. "Mrs. Winston," Rodriguez was saying, "we just need to clarify a few more details about your activities this morning." "Mommy!" Malik burst past his father and ran to Kesha, who caught him in a fierce hug that spoke of hours of worry and fear. Kesha looked up at Darius over their son's head, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are we okay? Are we really okay?" "We're okay," he confirmed, moving to place a hand on her shoulder while still holding Ava. "And Officer Rodriguez was just about to explain why she continued questioning you after discovering my identity." Rodriguez looked between them in confusion. "Your identity?" "I'm Assistant Director Winston, FBI Counter-Terrorism Division," Darius said calmly. "Your partner discovered this information approximately 10 minutes ago. The fact that you continued to hold and question my wife after that discovery is going to be a significant factor in the federal charges you're facing." The color drained from Rodriguez's face. "Federal charges: civil rights violations, deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to violate civil rights, possible kidnapping charges related to the detention of minor children," Darius listed calmly. "The exact charges will depend on the U.S. Attorney's Office, but I can guarantee you'll be hearing from them." Kesha stood slowly, still holding Malik, her nursing training helping her process what was happening, even as her mother's heart struggled to catch up. "You're FBI." "He is," Rodriguez whispered, slumping back in her chair. "Oh God, what have we done?" "You profiled a family based on race, detained us without cause, separated children from their parents, and made threats against minors," Darius answered, "all while being recorded by federal surveillance equipment." He looked down at his family, his wife still pale with shock, his son clinging to his mother's leg, his daughter finally calm in his arms, and felt a surge of protective fury that he kept carefully controlled. But that's not the worst part. He continued. The worst part is that you did all of this while we were trying to get to my grandmother's funeral. The worst part is that you traumatized my children for no reason other than your own prejudices. The worst part is that you threatened a 6-year-old boy with juvenile detention to try to force a confession for crimes we didn't commit. Rodriguez looked like she might be sick. We didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, Kesha said quietly, her voice steady despite everything they had endured. You saw what you expected to see, and you treated us accordingly. From the hallway came the sound of heavy footsteps and authoritative voices. The federal response had arrived in force, and, from the sounds of it, they were not happy about what they had found. Mr. and Mrs. Winston. A voice called from the doorway. Special Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. Sir, we've been monitoring the situation. Are you and your family safe? Darius turned to see a woman in a dark suit, flanked by several other federal agents. Behind them, he could see airport security personnel and what looked like local FBI leadership. The cavalry had arrived. We're safe now, he confirmed. Agent Chen, I assume you've been briefed on the situation? We've been monitoring in real time through your communication device, she confirmed grimly. The entire incident has been recorded and documented. We're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office for Federal Charges, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has been notified. She looked at Rodriguez, who seemed to shrink under the federal agent's gaze. Officer Rodriguez, you're under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights echoed through the small room, Darius gathered his family closer. They had been through enough. It was time to go home. To attend the funeral they had never stopped trying to reach. To begin healing from trauma that should never have happened. Agent Chen, he said quietly, my family and I need to catch a plane to Atlanta. My grandmother's funeral is tomorrow. She nodded, understanding. Of course, sir. We'll handle the scene here. Delta has been notified and is holding your flight. There will be federal agents on board for security, and we'll have a team in Atlanta to assist with any follow-up. As they walked through the airport toward their delayed flight, Darius felt the weight of the morning's events settling on his shoulders. The immediate crisis was over, but the consequences would ripple outward for months, maybe years. There would be investigations, trials, media attention. There would be congressional hearings about racial profiling and airport security, policy changes, training programs. The HOA security program that had allowed undertrained officers to detain and interrogate travelers would likely be disbanded entirely. But all of that was in the future. Right now, his family was safe. They were together, and they were going to make it to Atlanta in time to say goodbye to the woman who had shaped Darius into the man he had become. Daddy, Malik said as they approached their gate, are those bad police officers going to jail? Darius considered his answer carefully. His son had seen too much today. Learned too early that the world wasn't always fair, that authority figures weren't always trustworthy. But he had also seen justice in action, had witnessed his father standing up for their family, had learned that even when bad things happen, good people fight to make them right. Yes, buddy, he said finally, they're going to face consequences for what they did. And hopefully, what happened to us today will help make sure it doesn't happen to other families. Malik nodded solemnly, then brightened. Will you tell Great-Grandma's funeral about how you caught the real bad guys? Darius smiled for the first time all day. I think Great-Grandma would have been proud of how brave you were today, how you took care of your sister, and tried to tell them who I was. She would have been mad at those police officers, Malik said with certainty. Great-grandma didn't like bullies. No, Darius thought as he watched his family board the plane that would finally take them to Atlanta. She really didn't. 6 months later, the consequences of that morning at Denver International Airport were still reverberating through the law enforcement and civil rights communities. Officers Mitchell and Rodriguez had pleaded guilty to federal civil rights charges and were serving sentences of 18 months and 2 years respectively. The private security company that had hired them faced massive civil lawsuits and had lost contracts across the country. The Winston family's lawsuit against the HOA and the airport authority had been settled for an undisclosed sum, reportedly in the 7 figures. But more importantly, their case had led to sweeping changes in airport security protocols, mandatory bias training for all law enforcement personnel, and the creation of independent oversight boards for private security contractors. Perhaps most significantly, the airport authority had used part of the settlement money to create the Ava Winston Family Assistance Center, a facility designed to help families navigate travel emergencies and security issues with dignity and respect. The center was staffed by trained counselors and advocates, and its walls were decorated with photos of families from all backgrounds, all traveling with hope and love toward their destinations. Darius had returned to his work with the Counter-Terrorism Division, but he also testified regularly before Congress about the intersection of national security and civil rights. He spoke at police academies and training centers, sharing his story not as revenge, but as education, helping officers understand that the people they served came from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all circumstances. Kesha had taken a leave of absence from her nursing job to focus on advocacy work, partnering with civil rights organizations to push for accountability and reform in law enforcement. She traveled the country, telling their story, not because she enjoyed reliving the trauma, but because she knew that sunlight was the best disinfectant for the kind of prejudice they had faced. Malik, now 7, had developed a sophisticated understanding of justice and fairness that impressed adults and worried his parents in equal measure. He could explain the difference between good police officers and bad ones, could articulate why profiling was wrong, and had told his class that his daddy's job was making sure everyone gets treated fairly. Ava, now 2.5, remembered nothing of that terrible morning, but benefited from the increased awareness and protections that had resulted from it. She would grow up in a world where her family's trauma had been transformed into positive change, where their pain had become purpose. The story of what happened at Denver International Airport became a case study in law schools and criminal justice programs, an example of how individual acts of prejudice could have far-reaching consequences, and how the system could work eventually to deliver justice and create change. But for the Winston family, the most important outcome was simpler. They had survived. They had faced injustice and emerged stronger, closer, more committed to each other and to the principles that Darius fought for every day in his work. They made it to the funeral, 6 hours late, but present for what mattered most. And when Darius stood to speak about his grandmother, he talked about her strength, her dignity, her refusal to accept unfairness in any form. "She taught me," he said to the gathered mourners, "that our character is defined not by what happens to us, but by how we respond to what happens to us. She taught me that justice is not a destination, but a journey, and that every step of that journey matters." As he looked out at his family, at the community that had supported them through their ordeal, at the faces of people who had been inspired by their story to demand better from their institutions, he knew that his grandmother would have been proud. She would have been proud that they had turned their pain into purpose, their trauma into transformation, their suffering into strength. Most of all, she would have been proud that they had never stopped believing in justice, even when justice seemed impossibly far away. The morning at Denver International Airport had been the worst day of their lives. But it had also been the beginning of something larger, something more important than their individual experience. It had been the first step in a journey toward a more just world, a world where families could travel without fear, where children could grow up believing in fairness, where the color of someone's skin didn't determine how they were treated by those sworn to protect and serve. It wasn't the ending they had planned, but it was the ending they had earned through courage, through perseverance, through an unshakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today. And in the end, that was enough.